worked, how it started off, and what were some of the texts you went back to or were constantly reading over and over?
Ah, well, it goes. I think I mentioned it goes back about 30 years. Started at Kent. It was a mixture of masters and not many PhD students I had then, and PhD students. Gradually, the number of troubling PhD students increased, and we had just PhD group of my students. Of course, I think reading groups can't be too large. And I think for quite a while, it's rather more conventional now. I think it might be because people are rather more concerned about absorbing knowledge conventionally than before, but as well as text, standard, not standard, but academic texts of various kinds. I mean, it was basically up to the people to decide, week to week, as it were. We did other things. Went to exhibitions up at the Wellcome Centre, poetry. We discussed poetry, and then we also had, and this has been adopted now for the whole PhD community in law at Birkbeck, we also had a kind of a Christmas read in which everyone would nominate a book. Then we'd have a vote based on a secret ballot, which I ran scrupulously fairly, of course, and whatever the book was, we'd read it and then discuss it in the first session in the new year. I can't remember any except Dostoevsky's Brothers Karamazov, but yeah, that was about the full range of stuff. I think most of the reading, to be fair to say, would be of the post-structural Foucauldian feminist kind. I can't recall, in terms of our combined interests, as it were, how much reading we did on, say, imperialism, post-colonialism, and so on. I suspect not enough.
The one text that keeps coming back, from my experience, is Derrida's Force of Law.
That's a hardy perennial. We've just actually finished discussing it, particularly part one, and then we squeezed in.
So what keeps drawing you back to that text, or why is it
to that text? I think
part of the canon for your students in a sense?
Oh, well, I think it's the most astonishing text in existence on law. And to me, well, a lot of other Derrida does too, but in an incredibly pointed way, it brings out the revolutionary quality of Derrida and post-structural thought. The emphasis on relationality, sociality, and all the rest of it, he sort of drags in there from Politics of Friendship and other places, and doesn't carry on about it, but in drawing out the so-called mystical quality of law, he has right at the end of part one this marvelous formula of the ill foe, as he puts it. It must, each of the two dimensions of law that he isolates, which are reductively called, the responsive, the utterly responsive, and the determinate. How these, and this to me dissolves a lot of the debate or redirect profitably, whichever way you want to put it, on positivism, law and society, various types of connectivity between law and so on. You have the two, as it were, approaching each other. Each must, says Derrida, in a wonderfully elegant formula, I think, exceed the other, but in the direction of the other. So the determinant is needed to bring the responsive in, the responsive is needed to keep propelling the determinative out, as it were. And he doesn't, that kind of almost structural, if one can use the word elegance, I haven't seen him put it about law or deed much else. He looks at other things like the autoimmune and so on. It tends to be, not a reproduction, but closer to a reworking of what he said elsewhere. But I think the thing on law and the whole quality of the mystical, which can then be dramatically contrasted to faith and knowledge, where he draws the distinction between the beyond as being the unscathed, but he then incorporates, and I think this connects to Force of Law, he then incorporates what we could call the dimensions of the religious, the faith and knowledge, denies the unscathed quality and brings it within the world, but does not deny the dimensions, the constituent dimensions of the two. And I think that, if I'm not being too formulaic, that kind of mystic element, which I think has developed much more in a sense in faith and knowledge, is the wonderful thing that he then amplifies and brings to bear on law. I think it's just so incredibly rich and productive, not just about law, but about a whole sort of anti-modernist, post-Enlightenment type supremacism. Beautifully undercuts the whole thing, but doesn't leave nothing there. It says, this is it. Il faut, it must. The imperative is still there. It's not an abdication. I've raved too long on that one. But yeah.
But when does this engagement with Derrida begin, and how do you see it as connecting with your disposition towards the post-colonial and the imperial tendencies of law?
I think that bit that I just said about the connection with the almost covert revolutionary thrust of Derrida is something I've only appreciated very recently, actually. And the sort of dipping into Derrida, if you like, was quite a long time ago, but the growing commitment, obsession, whatever it might be, is a matter of the last mere 20 years or something, I think. So it's quite. I think there's a volume I saw threateningly around here before called Modernism and the Grounds of Law. I think that's where it sort of got me at that point. But it was around earlier. I think in mythology, I think it's there, but Foucault wins there, and Derrida wins later on. Yeah.
That was the next question we had, was, and it briefly came up in the conference, around what happens between mythology and modernism as the grounds for law. What are the sort of things that you're grappling with? What changes for you?
Well, judging from the coherence that people kindly found in mythology, I think what happens is things get messed up to an extent, because I don't think, although shamefully I haven't looked at it for quite a long while, modernism is as coherent as mythology. I think it's more exploratory. I think I was trying to bring certain modes or bodies or whatever it might be of thought into a particular setting, and just going for the Derrida bit again, I think that's mainly chapter 2 from memory. I was trying to say, well, look, in a companionate way, not in an oppositional way. I think I was trying to say, well, look what he's saying. Look what he's saying in relation to law specifically, and the imperative of what law would have to be law, as quite an applied, instrumental, and practical matter. It would, in order to deal with sociability and the relation between us, it would have to have the ability ever to be responsive to what came from, as it were, beyond, and called out for it to determine that. But that would just simply be a vacuity. For the rule of law, for law to rule, it also has to be determined. So it has to be both those things. So we go back to the Il faut formula again, and so on and so forth. I was just trying to show that what this is not a kind of remote threatening, philosophical type exercise. That it's an integral thing. It's got political purchase. It's got enormous historical and political significance as well, which are in turn inseparable from our concerns about law. So it was just meant to be a kind of almost boringly pedagogical applied work. But I think in the process I ended up doing it in too many different chunks, really.
So one way that I experience the relationship between mythology of modern law and modernism and the grounds of law is that if mythology, there's a funny kind of spatial inversion. So if mythology is the transcendent, modernism and the grounds of law is the grounds. So if you tell a structural story of law in mythology in a certain kind of way, then for me grounds is where you push through some of the ways in which you think that the mythic dimension of law plays itself out. So the obsession. So the idea of it being more bitsy, I think, relates to the way in which you want to push through the idea of origin, or you want to push through the idea of ground.
Exactly.
And so you have to keep breaking the waves on the same shore. So it ends up being less of one story and more of a sort of difference in repetition of the sort of impelling elements of the account that underpin mythology but weren't actually drawn out there.
I'd say that's exactly right. I think origin in particular ends up taking the place, in quotes, of the myth in terms of the impelling force of bringing that to bear. What the work doesn't do enough of, I think, I mean, it was originally called, well, I was hoping for it to be originally called terminal legality, which was, sort of a disposition or disposing of the old, and this is what we put in its place, and then underlying that would be the subtitle of Modernism and Grounds of Law. Cambridge University Press didn't want the title.
Why not?
The reason, very sound practical reason, is when it came to classifying the book in terms of bookshops and libraries, it would be put in under the heading of Law for Funeral Directors. So terminal legality got scrapped, and I said, well, just leave the subtitle, which that's not a great title.
But actually, death is a useful segue here, because one word I haven't heard you mention in response to Arthur's question, but which for me is important both in how we read Derrida's Force of Law in your reading group and also in your work, is the question of violence.
Yes.
So do you want to say something about how you understand or the influences that you have had in thinking about law and violence? So I'm thinking also of your relationship, or one of the texts that came back was Robert Cover.
Oh, yes.
And so I just wondered if you wanted to say something more about violence as it plays out in relation to law as you understand it.
Well, I guess it depends upon, the range of the term violence. I mean, if one takes the more expansive range, which becomes characteristic of, academic usage generally, I think, then there's always a violence of determination. There's always what Derrida would call, with the decision, the legal decision in particular, a cutting off of the possibility of things being otherwise, a cutting off that sort of contains and denies, in a sense. And then, as if to reassure us that what the imperative il faut formula imports, pretty soon after that, I think, he emphasizes that what he calls justice, but what I'm saying is the responsive dimension of law and of sociality and relationality, etc., that utter responsiveness is compatible with the greatest, I don't think he says, I can't remember what noun he uses, it's not evil, but it's
The worst.
The worst, compatible with the worst, exactly. So it's not a Panglossian kind of, delusion of any kind. It is compatible with the worst. So the range of violence from the ordinary, as it were, everyday cutting off of the decision and so on, which, as Derrida emphasizes, as soon as you do that, the next millisecond, as it were, and of course he quotes Kierkegaard, the madness of the decision, where you have to actually, make a decision by denying certain stuff which rationally, in other ways, you would like to, or even in terms of existential empathy, you might want to take account of. It's a madness. Of course, we have to focus in this limited, mad kind of way in order to make the decision. But having done that, once that enters the world, instantly it starts becoming something else, the way it works itself in the world, because of the responsive dimension. So those two things, it's not just a matter of one and one, bang, they come together and then they go apart again. It's a constant constituent interaction between them, which violence is central to, really.
So is violence a point of connection between you're thinking with the continental philosophers and you're thinking about colonial legality or post-colonialism or imperialism. In other words, why deploy more European philosophy to think about the post-colonial? Or how do we do it? How do you do it?
I think my emphasis, this might have been rather evasive and a deficiency, in terms of making adequate connections here, but my emphasis was, I think, the thing with the cover was called "Why the Law is Also Non-Violent," I think was the title. And that was, in order to understand the element of violence, one had to appreciate the element of the responsive and so on, that the two existed together. But of course, compatible with the worst, as someone reminded me, that does not mean that there's going to be any, that there's going to be much scope for feeling rather pleased with the outcome. If I think it would just, well, I would say there is a break point really, which is manifested most directly, for want of a better term, most luridly almost, by the appropriation of the modern colonial, say compared to the pre-modern similar ventures or the Roman Empire and so on, which was a completeness of appropriation that we, whoever we might be, we Occidentals, or certain of us, we Occidentals, post-Enlightenment especially, are able to encompass the world and bring being to bear on a world in a way that can create others as a thing or things in themselves, and then appropriate them to what we could call imperial purposes, for want of again putting it rather in rather lame terms. So that's pushing the determinate beyond, in a sense, and in a way which, in terms at least of its own operation, denies the responsiveness as any kind of an imperative opening, because we've got the answer, we've got it in advance, we bring it to bear. Positivism, legal positivism, is intrinsically imperial. That mode of law.
Because it closes off the responsive dimension.
It does. It just says we're bringing to bear either A, what the sovereign determines, or B, what usage, practice, or meaning, or in Hart's terms, what the core, the persistent core of meaning, actually requires us to do. It's we're automatons. We just have to react to that. Brian Simpson once, of course, Brian wasn't a radical, but he once put it beautifully. He said, the trouble with precedent was that judges have to decide, if they're having to decide what sort of case is binding, they have to decide what the case is that's going to be binding. So it sort of undercuts the whole, common law precedent type stuff. But of course, I guess the more, quote, European, unquote, stuff is more geared towards a more straightforward positivism, but no difference ultimately.
So what came first for you, thinking about positive law or thinking about sovereignty? Because sovereignty is another idea or concept that recurs in your work.
A positive law, definitely.
Right, and so do you remember when you started thinking about sovereignty, particularly when you started thinking about sovereignty as a pivot, as you have put it somewhere, between the national and the international, which for me was a very revelatory way of thinking about sovereignty. Do you remember how you began to think about sovereignty that led you to that idea?
Very brief answer is no.
I know, it's hard to reconstruct the thought, but I mean, compared to how international lawyers think about sovereignty, and compared to how domestic lawyers think about sovereignty, for me it was a revelation to read an account of sovereignty that placed sovereignty between something. And the pivot was, I think, has been very important to many people trying to theorise the domestic and international.
Yeah.
So I'm wondering if you have any sense of how you got there, how
Well,
you thought of that.
I've got a bit of sense of where I've ended up in a way, but that might indicate how I got in there, because I still think it's, our engagement with this issue is quite incomplete. It seems to me that, you get myths, if you like, of Westphalia and all the rest of it, which says, this is where it was all invented, and, factory fresh, it rolls out the back door. And there it is all of a sudden, which is nonsense, of course, because it was around beforehand, and it certainly didn't massively displace what was already there. There were certain key adaptations for sure, but that's the myth in the sense, not in the dismissive sense. It is actually a myth. What I think needs to be looked at, and I haven't done it properly or done it enough, is the way in which the Hispanic colonizations and the idea of the state developed there, how that doesn't just become, a kind of sovereignty that you have one block here, another block here, another block here, and that as nations or incipient nations and distinct incipient nations and so on come together in some sort of agreement and create the inter. The inter is already there. And one can deal with this in a way, conceptually or analytically or whatever, but historically, I don't think probably enough work has been done, but I don't know about it. That kind of connectivity that emerged as a result of imperium, an expansive imperium, and not as something that preceded and simply powered it.
So, sort of continuing this theme of Derrida responsiveness,
Right.
and violence and decisions. Do you think so? Derrida is grappling with the problem of inheritance of Europe, which seems to go through his entire work, especially in the latter period. Do you feel you've had a similar grappling with the problem of Europe or the Occident, how to inherit this colonial modernity and the violence that entails?
I think it's probably similar in terms of direction, but and I think what's salutary about Derrida on that score is, and this is something that would have been wonderful if he and Foucault hadn't had that squabble, that they could have connected up more on, because what the deconstructive and so on enables, I think, is some kind of retrogression to where the classic political formulations come from, and to put it blandly, a rereading of them, which shows that the way they're made up is not as they've been accepted, or not entirely as they've been accepted. So the thing I used about Hobbes, at the conference, no, not about Hobbes, I mean Rousseau, at the conference, is that was just Derrida, but I used Rousseau because what he was saying was Derridean. But of course that's not the way it's normally read, but it's actually there, and it's hard to avoid that meaning. But if you accept that meaning, then you have to go forward on the basis that seeing Rousseau as creating, previous to the Déclaration des droits de l'homme, etc., the model for that, which is sovereignty, law, and the only allowable connectivity between them, sovereignty, the individual, the only allowable connectivity between them being law. No, he's not saying that. He's saying we have to be before the social contract what we are after it, and he's got a beautiful, rendition of these quasi-deific creatures, which are just Derridean responsive gods, in a sense, bringing to bear and inducing in us a sociality. Without going on too much about it, Hobbes similarly. The standard take on Hobbes, and it's around. It's almost entirely undisturbed. Is we have to elevate, because life is nasty, British, and short, and so on. We have to elevate the sovereign. Sovereign has to have absolute power, etc., etc. No. He embeds that in an idea of sociality, but that bit gets thrown out. It's considered to be secular, it's considered even to be atheist. Do people not read the second half of Leviathan? Which is, it's a rather heterodox religion, but it's religious. The sort of stuff James Martell draws on, for example. So I think with a Derridean perspective sort of trajected back, a bit like Foucault's History of the Present, enables you to sort of go through this stuff and bring it forward in this revamped way, as it were, which again I think brings out the unacknowledged almost, but at least underemphasized revolutionary quality of Derrida's thought, and of Foucault's too, of course.
Do you describe yourself as a Derridean? Too much of a label.
I'm not that good. No, I don't think so. I mean, I would readily describe myself as an intense admirer. I guess the horrible term is follower or something, but not in the sense that I'd say that it's all there in a sense, and that's ultimately what I'm going to rely upon, because I'm never sure what I'm going to ultimately rely upon when I do this stuff. Yeah.
Peter had a question which sort of reflects upon. So, the first time I read your work was with a concern with the problem of indigeneity in international law.
Okay.
So, and it was really illuminating for me. So I wanted to get a sense of how you reflected upon the problem of indigeneity in modern law,
Right.
particularly in the context, in the settler colonial context,
Right.
More specifically in the Australian case,
Right.
with Mabo and your comments on Mabo,
Right.
and perhaps some reflections upon your more recent engagement with indigenous literature and art.
Okay. I have a slight guilt about Mabo because very slight, no, perhaps not very slight, but what I wrote about Mabo involved disagreeing rather sharply with Brennan, and he was a rather distant friend of the family on my mother's side, and also acted for my mother in her divorce. And I was a rather fresh-faced article clerk at the time, and so I had quite a bit to do with him over that, because I sort of took over the running of it. My father cut me off from any type of beneficial inheritance thereafter. So, and he was lovely. So I thought, oh my God, no. But of course you have to do what you have to do, I suppose. Anyway, I mean, the thing I think that is a kind of almost an affront is if you look at Mabo, and then if you go way back, as it were, to the so-called Indian cases in the States at the end of the well, ages ago, isn't it? It was even before Austin, and I sometimes think that the origin of legal positivism is of that variety, or at least attributed to Austin. Again, it's very crude, what people say about Austin. It wasn't that straightforward at all. Anyway, he didn't invent it. Marshall and Co. on the U.S. Supreme Court invented legal positivism because they took and started out with, and Marshall sort of had the advantage, if you like, of not being a lawyer, actually, even though he was Chief Justice. And he had a kind of a non-indoctrinated approach to law. And he actually had the attitude which makes the whole thing so sharp in the contrast with the result of saying, well, really these people should be included in what's going on. So, if you're going to inhabit land together and so on, there should be some kind of sociality, relationality, equality, and all the rest of it. Was that that propelled quite a lot of what he's saying. But nonetheless, he drew the distinction between the Indian as having certain conspicuous deficiencies and the rest, and said, well, unfortunately, they have to be relegated. But he still more or less said that law would take us along the path of incipient inclusion, whereas he then asserted the sovereign right, which of course was a colonial claim, He threw out a lot of classic justifications like conquest and all the rest of it, but at the end of the day he said we have to do what the sovereign, namely the government of the day in a sense, is telling us. And so, that variety of legal positivism was there. The other members of the court, sort of Johnson and so on, fell into line neatly. Johnson had a bit of divinity thrown in somewhere just to back it all up. But you skip over to Marlborough, and despite the press it gets, what's the result? You don't have the rule of law in Australia, you have the rule of the sovereign. Why do you have the rule of the sovereign? What's the ultimate and the clearest and definitive statement of it? It's Marlborough. Why people? Well, sorry, this gets a bit almost petulant, but why people can't see the connection then between the suppression, the relegation, the divisiveness, as it were, that's created by that, and the elevation of a sovereign which claims unlimited power, but for a specific entity, which in itself is a claim to transcendence. It's Deleuze and Guattari saying, as soon as immanence becomes immanent to something, with a capital S on the something, you elevate that to the transcendent. So it's a neo-deific claim to transcendence. It's insane, if I may put it that way. It comes from that, as far as the relationship or lack of relation in settled colonies goes, that's exactly where it comes from. Simple. But of course, it can't be in a sense recognised operatively in some way, because it would undercut the whole premise of the imperial as norm, and the continuate imperial as norm. Yeah.
And the engagement with indigenous literature, it talked about more recently in some of your texts.
Yes, I haven't engaged very much with it there. It's just been a little bit here and there as a byproduct of working with Kathleen Birrell, and I've never engaged with it on an extensive basis, or presumed to, I should say. I think I tend to say literature indigenous or otherwise, because I don't want to say something specific and distinct about it, for various reasons. And so it's in the context where I'm talking about literature and law generally, rather than a prime or even a predominant focus on it. So I haven't. And Australian indigenous literature I don't know so well as, say, the US and so on.
So, thinking back to the question about the sovereign assertion as the grounds of law in a sense, and the way that Australian law is the rule of the sovereign, when did you start thinking about the international?
Quite recently, I think.
And what?
It's probably the influence of somebody I'm talking to now.
So how did that sequence of thoughts play out in terms of the concern with the sort of constituent features of law?
Well, what happened, I think, was, but I'm not sure, that piece you referred to the other day in the Leiden Journal of International Law, I was asked to do that.
Gods would be needed to give men laws.
Yeah, I was asked to do that.
I think that was at the height of a renewed concern with American empire, from what I recall.
Yeah, it was the years of Bush #2. And I said, well, I can, but what I want to say is going to take, I'd much prefer it to be otherwise, but it was a bit like Shaw saying that apologising to one of his correspondents for writing a long letter because he didn't have time to write a short one. I said, well, look, I don't know too much about it. They still want me to do it. And it's going to take me a while to work it out, but I think it's going to be much too long for a journal. It's going to be, I thought about 20,000 words, so they said fine. So it is about 20,000 words. So I did that. And then that got me thinking about the international more directly, in a sense. And really, you're a tremendous influence as well. But when you look closely at the beast, and in terms of what I was interested in before, the international becomes not the aberrant exception. Allegedly, again, Austin was saying international law is not law. He didn't say that actually, but everyone says he says it. He had more nuance than that. You've got Hart's messy chapter on it in the concept of law, which he obviously can't make up his mind either, because he just arbitrarily said at the beginning that the paradigm of law is municipal law without saying why it is. My response to that bluntly would be the paradigm of law is the international. It's the it's not subordinate ultimately, despite Patel, etc. It's not subordinate ultimately to any congrues or particularities of sovereign assertion for its as it were, immediate application. There are areas of international law which subsist quite or completely independently of the Vitalian imperative that it has to come from the state, and it can't, no matter what the state agrees to, the state still can't see itself as inhibited by this or restricted at all. The jus cogens and all the rest of it. There's of course a list, but by now custom, for goodness sake, the part of custom in international law is, at least for the amateur like me, was just wonderfully exciting, seeing the intricate way in which it was embedded in there in a way that was absolutely impossible to be subsumed within these crude sovereign-based assertions. I think something.
Did you see a resonance between international law and the common law?
Well, in the sense that the common law, despite Cook and everything, does develop in a kind of crazy way. That's going back to the Brian Simpson point. You can't say precedent is binding because you decide what's binding, what precedent you're going to use, etc. So it doesn't have ostensibly a pre-existent chamber into which it has to fit, or echo, or whatever. There's great similarities between custom and common law, I think. But of course, the effort always is to positivize the common law in some way by saying this is binding precedent and all the rest of it. Nonsense, no precedent is binding. In a Derridean sense, no precedent is binding.
A question about your experience with collaborative writing in this period. So you do, especially with your own students. So I'm thinking about especially about the book with Foucault with Ben Golder.
Yeah.
What was the experience like of writing with some, as a solitary scholar, writing with others?
Well, it's interesting, recently Richard Joyce came to a reading group, and somebody raised reference to a thing that we'd written together, and said, and sort of asked Richard, what he meant by this thing that, and he said, I don't know, he said, I never even saw it until... so I think that, if he's telling the truth, I think that collaborative experience was a very straightforward one. But I know they can be fraught, these things, but I've had nothing but the happiest experience of writing with people. Ben and my effort was somewhat distanced in the sense that he did most of the work. Hence I insisted, that the normal expectation, conventional expectation of who goes first in terms of alphabetical order had to be reversed. I was responsible for throwing out the text, but it's the footnotes that are the most wonderful thing about that book. They're so incredibly rich, and Ben knows more about Foucault than anyone else alive, really. So it was like a division of labour more than anything else, although he did a lot of text as well. That one was that. And there's been a few more recent ones. I don't know, it hasn't been, at all. And of course the book with Eve and just doing introductions to books. Of course I've edited quite a few books jointly with people. I'm trying to think of something interesting and dramatic and conflict-ridden that happened just to make the thing more engaging as an answer, but I'm afraid it's been uniformly smooth, actually. Yeah.
Do you, just to dwell in the idea of writing, have a particular pattern to how you write? Do you do, was it Matisse who used to leave his front door and walk around the house and come back in through the front door in order to start his work day?
Yes, yes.
So how do you write?
I write like I really don't think I should write. I think writing is such a demanding thing and such a pain in many ways, you know, and because it's basic uncertainty is the thing that gets me. You know you've got to say this, you know what you're going to say is not going to be that by the time you actually write, but you don't know what the hell it's going to be or whether in the hell you're going to be able to do it. So I mean, you know, the almost invariable practice of writers whom I know, like novelists and so on, is that you really just got to mark out a certain period during the day, no matter what. You know, your kid could be drowning in the creek down the hill, you've got to let them drown, you know. You've just got to keep going. It's an utter imperative. Otherwise, if you don't have that banking, marking off discipline, you don't do it. I'm much more loose than that. I sort of pile up too much stuff, a sense of insecurity, I think. It takes me so long then to sort it out, but by the time I've sorted it out, if I've done a bit of it, I've got to then plunge into it immediately, otherwise that will all disappear.
Right. So you read and write and read and write.
Exactly, yeah. So it comes out in chunks, and not necessarily at any particular hour of the day or night.
Do you write every day?
No. I do have bursts, but they're still in chunks. But there'll be quite long periods when I'll write and then bang, that will be that chapter or half a chapter or a quarter of a chapter, and then I go away and have to resort things because I accumulate too much stuff.
Are there moments when you do other things in order to help you think through ideas? So I'm thinking in particular of walking and your relationship to walking, and particularly walking in Kent.
I'm not too sure why, but walking and running, or I think the word now is jogging. I used to get very upset when I'd be going for a run and some officious or intrusive visitor would say, "Oh, you're off for a jog." No, I'm off for a run. Anyway, sorry, it's jogging. That's, in some way, that's essential, absolutely essential. The other thing that's essential is some relationship to the garden. And of course I don't know why or how, but I do know that if I don't do that every day, then it throws me off kilter, yeah. So it's just kind of negative proof, really.
Do you still think of yourself as a Catholic?
Not at all, no. I was a very devout Catholic for quite a long time. I've probably told you the story before, but the brief version is that when I came over to London to work with Baker Mackenzie, the church I went to was just at the back of Marble Arch, and I used to go, you know, Sundays, but often during the week as well. And I'd take the Eucharist and get the statutory high and all the rest of it. Then one day the priest said that my Lord Archbishop is not well, so we should pray for him. And so I said, hang on a minute, we Catholics refer to your grace, not my Lord. And I felt, well, you know, and then I noticed a pile of books down the end of the pew. I slid down the end of the pew, looked at the Book of Common Prayer. So I'd been going to a very high Anglican, very, very high Anglican church for quite a while. That sort of destabilised me somewhat. Not immediately, but that plus associating with some, you know, corrupting company in London, including my future spouse, sort of. I just don't know where it went to, but it's certainly gone. Yeah.
Well, it tells us about your belief, but what about practice or vocation in terms of how you experience your life as a scholar?
Well, I think again, we don't know these things, of course, for sure, do we? But I think whatever it was that impelled me to have a vocation, as it's called conventionally in religious terms and so on, and priesthood, either continued or endured from that period And basically I'm a very boring person who either engages with a couple of days in London with students and PhDs and so on, but for the rest of the time I sit at my desk, or throw around files, or run or walk sometimes with Shelby, or garden. And all my peers of a certain age, of the same age as me, are sort of going on cruises and seeing the world and leading a fulfilled life because of all they've already accomplished. I'm not saying that I persist because it's heroic or anything. I persist because I can't envisage myself doing anything else. So I think I'm stuck with it.
How do you think that sense of vocation and your own inhabiting of a particular way of being shapes how you are as a supervisor or teacher?
I think it starts to sound a bit like the pastoral, doesn't it?
I didn't say that.
No, you very wickedly pushed me in that direction. Okay, I'll have to buy that, I think. I'm perhaps more Catholic and priestly than I imagined. Also, I think, if one looks at it that way, which I haven't, it's your fault, all this. If you think about what I was trying to say earlier on about Derrida and, the bringing of what you could call the mystical or the religious, whatever, with in the world, so that those, for want of a better term, constituent forces are there, but they're not, being elevated to the dimension of the unscathed, the infallible, etc., etc., but operate within, but still they are the same in a sense, then that could, the religious thing could account for that as well. I do think that the experience of two priests at Downlands College, where I went to secondary school, did, as father substitutes almost, did have an incredibly deep effect on me. And they were both very generous. So quite apart from the pastoral in a almost technical or vocational sense, etc., I think that told me that behaving like that is somehow mixed up in what you should be doing anyway. So it's not there in terms of some, surpassing virtue. It's just part of the job description, really, as it was for them. They didn't elevate themselves. I don't know whether I might have said this already, but Brendan Sykes, Father Sykes, who was a priest there, when I enrolled at the University of Queensland to do this degree by correspondence, you did a couple of arts degrees, and one was French, and of course I wasn't speaking French with anyone in Dalby, actually. Might surprise you to hear. And
Dolby.
And so the dear man, I'd go up every second weekend to Downlands, and we'd spend the whole day. If I had to write something on a play of Racine or Molière or something, we'd go through it very carefully. He'd tell me about the intonations and how that poetically connected to that, so I started learning French, how to speak it rather than just write about it or write it. And I wasn't there anymore. I'd been away for quite a while, yet he devoted himself to it.
So I think anybody who knows you, who's come across you either as a formal supervisor or as an informal mentor or interlocutor, and the way that your reading groups in London became refuges for many kinds of people, whether because they were critical and not in institutions that allowed that, or whether they were abandoned because they needed companionship and teaching and leadership. I suppose that's a terrible, we'll edit that out. They needed guidance. And so one of the things that people carry away from having worked with you or thought with you is that practice of reading.
Mm.
So a certain kind of ethos of scholarship,
Mm.
care, which I think is reflected in the way that you described how people don't read Austen and they don't read Hart and they don't read Hobbes, and yet they pick up a received account and run with it.
Exactly, yeah.
So do you think that the university as a place has, how would you reflect upon the changes in the university or not in relation to the kind of reading and scholarship that is possible now compared with some time ago?
Oh boy. This could go on and on, I think, this one. I think, again, one can't be too precise about this for obvious reasons, but I think the idea of the university as a place where, you know, in terms of staff and so on, there's security of tenure and all the rest of it. There's a place where you don't pay very talented people usually very much money, and they opt to join in that because it enables them to, you know, to be free, fairly free, and develop stuff and read Hobbes properly, as it were. I think that, and I'm not just talking about any particular institution or any particular country even now, I'm just talking very generally, but I'm afraid rather accurately from what I know of Europe and the United States and elsewhere. If you start running an institution in a way that involves quite intrusive surveillance, implicit demands connected to that, implicit, almost at times pretty well close to explicit demands connected to periodic assessments. If you grade people in terms of their contribution to research or the grade of a journal to which they've contributed, etc., because that gets used as a criterion for deciding how much money your university is going to get, etc., etc. We're not just talking about neoliberal managerialism or anything like that. We're talking about, for some reason, which I suppose we might want to think about, we're talking about a degree of penetrative involvement in the lives of people who work in these institutions which exceeds that, in my experience anyway, of having worked, you know, with quite a few clients and so on in their firms in the old days, and knowing something of what they're still like from friendships which are retained in London. The universities are more, shall we say, controlling, or have the means of control, even if they don't exercise, but they're hovering there. Assessments by students are leading to greater market orientation. Legislation has just been passed in Britain about 3 weeks ago, which is going to consolidate certain supervisory bodies of tertiary education and have oversight type committees in different areas of the country having these oversight of and students are going to be represented on that. That's on teaching, okay, that particular initiative and that particular focus. I remember a colleague at Berkeley about a year ago, I was talking to him on the phone, telling me how a student had stormed into his room because he'd only got such and such a mark, and look at all the money his family was paying for him, but he deserves something more. US, only 29% of people who teach in universities are tenure-tracked or tenured. So the idea of collegiality, community, which kind of supported that ethos of inquiry and mutual concern and support. Sorry, an elaborate and rather conventional answer, but I think it's something like that. And that ethos is, to put it mildly, puts constraints and pressure on being otherwise. I'm not saying it's impossible to be otherwise. I mean, 90% of my PhD students become academics, and the subject does come up from time to time, whether that's what we should be these days, and I still confidently say it's still the best racket in town, but it's becoming increasingly difficult to do what we should be doing, and in the context in which we have to do it.
So if the university is transformed beyond repair in a sense, do you think we'll have to reinvent another space where it becomes possible to do what used to be possible in a university but is necessary socially? So in other words, a place of thought and a place of freedom of thought that in the near future may not be the university.
It indeed may not, but the tragedy, and I think irredeemable consequence of that, if you somehow could finance research institutes of various kinds and so on, and it's conceivable if one focused more on having those as well as, but with much more emphasis on, and then universities become more pedagogically focused and constrained and all the rest of it, you would miss out on the connection between. And this is where things have changed so much between the teaching and the research. Not just for what it does for you, but for what it does for students and for what they can do and want to do. No, I'll leave it at that. Yeah.
Someone who's briefly perused your work, you come across as someone who's really takes the demands of style very seriously and of fashioning one style. Do you think this is an accurate description of your work and of you?
After Friday, yes. I remember dear Ben Golder gave me a book once, and he wrote into something about To the Poet or something like that, I thought, hang on a minute, I do write poetry, but I didn't tell him, And that suggested to me that what he was saying the other day, and what Matt was so beautifully saying, there was something to it, but I've not consciously thought that I'm writing according to a particular style or that I'm a stylist. Never has that happened. And Friday was a revelation on that score.
Can you just say something about what you mean by Friday, just for the purpose
of
longevity of the video?
It was an event plotted by several people and prominently by my two interrogators now, to mark the 25th anniversary of the publication of a book of mine called Mythology of Modern Law. And it was a series of papers engaging with the book in various different ways, both then and very much now predominantly, or engaging, as we've just, our discussion just touched on, engaging with these previously unobserved elements of style and
so in that
and humour of all things. Goodness me! Yes.